The night Emily Foster boarded Flight 382 from Los Angeles to Tokyo, nothing about her demeanor suggested fear or hesitation. She was 19, a second-year university student, about to spend her first semester abroad in Japan. Airport security logs show her moving through the terminal alone, a small rolling suitcase in one hand and a faded backpack slung over her shoulder. Surveillance footage captured her stopping at a coffee stand near the gate, scrolling through her phone, before quietly joining the boarding line. Fellow passengers later described her as polite but reserved, the kind of traveler who kept to herself. She took a window seat toward the rear of the plane, seat 42A, stowed her bag overhead, and sent a final text to her mother before switching to airplane mode. The first 5 hours of the red-eye flight were uneventful. The aircraft climbed smoothly to cruising altitude, cabin lights dimmed, and most passengers settled into sleep or in-flight movies. Emily had brought a small paperback novel, which she read quietly under the glow of her seat light. At some point, she exchanged brief small talk with the young man seated next to her, but nothing memorable enough for him to recall later in detail. Flight attendants passed through the aisle with water and snacks, noting nothing unusual. It wasn't until the early morning hours, somewhere over the mid-Pacific, that conditions began to shift. A sudden pocket of turbulence rattled the cabin, jolting a few passengers awake. Overhead bins clattered, and the captain's voice came over the intercom, reassuring everyone that they'd be through the rough patch shortly. It was during this turbulence, according to multiple passengers, that Emily unbuckled her seatbelt and rose from her seat. She moved down the aisle toward the rear lavatories, steadying herself against seat backs as the aircraft shuddered. The flight attendant stationed in the galley remembered seeing her approach, but claimed she never saw her enter either restroom. Another passenger, seated a few rows behind Emily, later told investigators he assumed she had gone inside one of them, but when the turbulence subsided minutes later, she still hadn't returned to her seat. That was the moment her absence was first noticed. At first, the crew assumed she might still be in the restroom or stretching her legs somewhere in the cabin. But as the minutes ticked by, concern began to mount. A quiet search began, starting with the lavatories. Both were empty. Flight attendants checked the aisles in the galley and even asked nearby passengers if they had seen her return. No one had. The lead flight attendant then initiated a full cabin sweep, row by row from front to back, calling her name softly so as not to alarm other passengers. There was no sign of Emily Foster. By now, the captain had been informed. He instructed the crew to search again, including underseats in the storage compartments and within the service areas. Every space accessible to passengers was checked. The search was repeated twice. Nothing. A 19-year-old passenger had vanished somewhere over the ocean. The flight crew faced an impossible reality. There were only so many places a person could be on a sealed aircraft at 36,000 feet, and Emily wasn't in any of them. Crew members later told investigators they considered the possibility she had collapsed or become ill and was lying somewhere out of view, but the sweep was thorough. They found her belongings, her phone, passport, and boarding pass, still inside her backpack overhead in seat 42A. The captain requested that passengers remain seated for the remainder of the flight, while the crew discreetly monitored all exits and access points. It was not standard protocol to declare a missing person mid-air unless there was a clear medical emergency. But this case was different. Without making an announcement, the crew quietly prepared for the possibility of police involvement upon landing. As the hours crawled on toward Tokyo, the cabin atmosphere shifted. Word began to spread among passengers, whispered across aisles and murmured in low voices. Some described a tense, almost claustrophobic silence, broken only by the drone of the engines. For the remainder of the journey, every glance toward the rear of the plane carried the same unspoken question. Where could she have gone? When Flight 382 touched down at Narita International Airport, Japanese authorities were already waiting. The aircraft was directed to a remote stand instead of a regular gate, and police boarded immediately. Passengers were instructed to remain seated as officers began questioning the crew. Emily's name was confirmed on the manifest. Her baggage was located in the hold. Her seat, untouched except for the missing passenger, stood as a mute reminder of the impossible. Over the next hour, each passenger was escorted off individually for questioning and identification checks. The crew were interviewed separately. Emily's belongings were photographed and bagged as evidence. A full sweep of the aircraft was conducted again, this time by police and airline security together. The results were identical to the in-flight searches. No trace of her. The early consensus among investigators was disbelief. The laws of physics, the design of the aircraft, and the controlled nature of air travel all argued against what had just happened. There were no open doors during flight, no mechanical malfunctions, and no witnesses to any disturbance beyond the turbulence. Yet, a 19-year-old had vanished from a locked pressurized cabin with nowhere to go. As the passengers were finally released, most left the airport shaken, some visibly disturbed by what they had been part of. The crew remained for extended debriefings, each repeating their account in painstaking detail. For Emily's family back in California, the first official call from the airline did not contain explanations, only a confirmation. Their daughter had boarded the flight, her belongings had arrived in Tokyo, but she had not. It was a statement that would haunt them, and investigators, for years to come. Because behind it was a question that seemed impossible to answer, and yet one they would spend the next decade trying to solve. The moment Flight 382 rolled to a stop at the isolated stand at Narita, the crew knew this was not going to be a normal arrival. Japanese police boarded quickly, their presence quiet but heavy, moving straight to the captain and lead flight attendant. No one was allowed to disembark. Outside, ground crew stayed at a distance while armed officers positioned themselves near the doors, not as if they were expecting a dangerous suspect to emerge, but as if they were guarding a scene that had already become a crime. Inside the cabin, passengers shifted uneasily in their seats, glancing at each other with questions no one dared voice. Officers began moving row by row, collecting passports, scanning them, and cross-referencing boarding passes with the manifest. When they reached row 42, Emily's seat stood empty. Her backpack was retrieved from the overhead bin, zipped, light to the touch, with her passport and boarding pass neatly tucked inside. It looked like the belongings of someone who had simply stepped away for a moment, but there was no one to claim them. One by one, passengers were escorted off the plane and taken into a secure area of the terminal. They were questioned individually, some for only a few minutes, others for much longer. Most repeated the same details: the turbulence, Emily getting up, and then nothing. The young man who had sat beside her admitted he thought she was in the restroom for an unusually long time, but hadn't been concerned. Another passenger in the rear cabin recalled seeing her walk toward the back, but couldn't be certain if she entered either lavatory. None of the accounts lined up perfectly on timing. While passengers were being processed, Japanese authorities and airline security swept the aircraft again. Every compartment, galley, storage locker, service hatch, and cargo hold. The search turned up nothing. The doors had remained sealed since departure, and in-flight records showed no anomalies in cabin pressure or alarms that would indicate an exit mid-air. The pilots and crew insisted that was impossible. If a door had opened at cruising altitude, sensors would have triggered instantly and the aircraft would have experienced a rapid decompression. There had been no such event. Meanwhile, back in the United States, word reached the Los Angeles field office of the FBI within hours. Because Emily was an American citizen, U.S. authorities became directly involved. Agents contacted her parents before news outlets could. The call was short, factual, and devastating. Emily had boarded the flight. Her luggage had arrived. She had not. Within an hour, the family's home became a base of operations for federal agents, gathering background on Emily's life, her travel plans, her contacts in Japan, and any possible reason she might disappear voluntarily. Initial theories ranged from the bizarre to the grim. Some investigators wondered if she had attempted to hide in a service area to exit undetected after landing, perhaps as part of a stowaway scheme involving someone in Tokyo. Others considered the possibility of a concealed compartment inside the aircraft itself, a space used for smuggling contraband or people into which Emily might have been forced or lured. The most unsettling theory was that she had been the victim of a violent act, her body hidden somewhere on board, yet every search yielded nothing. The pilots maintained there was no scenario in which she could have left the plane mid-air without catastrophic alarms. The lead flight attendant repeated her account. She had seen Emily approach the rear galley but never saw her enter a lavatory or walk back toward her seat. She assumed the turbulence had delayed her return. Another crew member claimed they thought they saw Emily standing near the service area several minutes after the turbulence ended, but when pressed on the exact time, they hesitated, unsure if they had actually seen her or simply assumed they had. The inconsistencies began to trouble investigators. Timelines that should have been clear were blurred by human memory and the stress of the flight. The precise minute Emily was last confirmed, seen could not be agreed upon, and that gap, whether it was 2 minutes or 10, became the critical hole in the story. By the time the final passenger was released from questioning, the plane had been cordoned off for forensic processing. Japanese technicians photographed every inch of the cabin, swabbed surfaces for DNA, and logged the position of every piece of luggage. Emily's possessions were bagged and tagged, the passport carefully sealed as evidence. Her phone, powered off, was found at the bottom of the backpack with no unusual activity in its final hours of use. Back in California, her parents began the longest night of their lives. They had no answers, only the knowledge that their daughter had stepped onto a plane and vanished somewhere over the ocean. In Tokyo, the first press conference was held late in the evening. Authorities kept their statements short. A passenger was unaccounted for. The investigation was ongoing. All possibilities were being considered. But in the quiet of the closed airport terminal, those closest to the search were already confronting a truth they didn't want to say aloud. The laws of air travel, the security of sealed cabins, the procedures in place to prevent this kind of thing. None of them had stopped a 19-year-old from simply disappearing. And whatever had happened in that unaccounted-for stretch of minutes, they were starting to realize it had been more than turbulence. It had been the window in which Emily Foster slipped out of the world as they knew it. By the third day, Emily Foster's disappearance had moved from a contained investigation in Tokyo to an international media storm. News anchors repeated the same impossible fact. A 19-year-old American student had boarded a commercial flight to Japan and had somehow vanished mid-air. Every detail that was made public seemed to contradict the others. News crews set up outside both Narita Airport and the Foster family's home in California, cameras waiting for any new development. The story's sheer strangeness made it irresistible, and within hours of the first broadcasts, it had spread to headlines across Europe, Australia, and the Middle East. In the absence of clear answers, the narrative fractured into competing theories. Online forums sprang to life, each thread dissecting grainy airport security stills, tracking the flight path across the Pacific, and debating every known second of Emily's final movements. Some users insisted the case fit the profile of a targeted human trafficking operation, citing other disappearances from transit hubs in Asia. Others went further, claiming she was the victim of a covert government extraction, that someone with influence had removed her from the plane for reasons tied to intelligence work. The most fringe theories are pushed into science fiction, speculating about secret experiments, unmarked aircraft rendezvous, and even wormholes. Each new theory was fueled by the same thing: silence from the airline. Official statements from its headquarters were sparse and vague, offering condolences to the family while insisting the investigation was being handled by Japanese and American authorities. They would not address specific questions about internal security footage, flight crew protocols, or maintenance logs. The refusal to confirm or deny even basic points only deepened public suspicion that something was being hidden. Meanwhile, Emily's family was thrust into the spotlight. Her parents, visibly exhausted, stood together behind a podium at a small press conference organized by the U.S. Embassy in Tokyo. Her mother's voice trembled as she pleaded with anyone who might have information to come forward. Her father kept his eyes fixed on the floor, his jaw set in silence. They repeated that Emily had no reason to vanish willingly. She was excited for her studies abroad, had left behind personal items she valued, and had made plans to meet friends upon arrival. 2 days after the press conference, an unverified account began circulating online. It came from a man claiming to have been seated near the rear of the aircraft. He told a travel blog that during the turbulence, he saw 2 men in dark jackets standing close to a young woman who looked scared and disoriented. He claimed they were guiding her toward the rear service door, a door normally used only on the ground for catering or maintenance. According to him, the men looked like they belonged to the crew, but were not wearing standard uniforms. The story went viral instantly. Investigators took the claim seriously enough to interview the witness in person. His statements were detailed, but contained gaps. When asked to describe the woman, he said she was about the same height as Emily, with long hair, but admitted he never saw her face clearly in the dim cabin light. The crew's official logs showed no record of anyone entering the service area during the turbulence, and no doors had been opened mid-flight, something that would have triggered alarms visible to the pilots. The witness's account remained unconfirmed, suspended between possibility and fabrication. The surge of attention put intense pressure on both law enforcement teams. In Japan, detectives fielded dozens of tips a day, most of them dead ends or obvious hoaxes. In the U.S., the FBI assigned additional agents to comb through Emily's digital life, her messages, emails, and social media activity for any sign she had been in contact with unknown parties before the trip. Nothing suggested she had been lured or coerced, but nothing ruled it out either. Every media outlet wanted an exclusive, and every non-answer from officials became its own headline. Theories became more elaborate as they were repeated, each retelling adding details that had never been confirmed. Some claimed the witness on the plane had described Emily whispering frantically before being led away. Others said she had been seen with a second passport. None of these points were backed by evidence, but by the end of the week, they were being repeated as if they were fact. The foster family's appeals grew more desperate. They released childhood photos, shared stories about her kindness, and reminded the public that she was more than a headline. But for every sincere message of support, there were anonymous comments accusing her of staging her own disappearance or of being involved in something dangerous before the flight. The family avoided reading them, but the weight of suspicion from strangers was hard to ignore. Behind the scenes, the investigators' biggest problem was that they had almost no physical evidence beyond Emily's possessions. The plane had been searched twice. Security cameras at Narita showed no sign of her after the jetway. No one had come forward with a confirmed sighting on the ground. It was as if her presence on that flight existed only in the paperwork and in the memories of those who had seen her board. Still, the story refused to fade. For every person who dismissed it as unsolvable, there were 10 who couldn't let it go. And somewhere in the fog of theories, false leads, and conflicting accounts, a sliver of truth remained, a truth that for now was buried under the noise. But investigators were beginning to realize that one detail, one overlooked piece of testimony, might yet pull it to the surface. From the moment the media firestorm broke, investigators knew they had to shift focus from theories to evidence. Public speculation was drowning out fact, and the only way forward was through forensic reconstruction of the flight itself. In Tokyo, Japanese aviation security specialists began working side by side with FBI agents flown in from Los Angeles. Every piece of data from Flight 382 was pulled for review: the flight logs, the maintenance history, the seating chart, even the catering inventory. Nothing was too small to scrutinize. Security footage became the first priority. At Los Angeles International Airport, analysts pulled every angle covering Gate 76 on the night of departure. They tracked Emily through the terminal, noting the time she passed each checkpoint. She appeared calm, moving at a steady pace, her carry-on rolling behind her. The final camera caught her stepping into the jetway. After that, the camera's view was obstructed by the curve of the boarding corridor. There was no angle showing her actually stepping into the aircraft. Not unusual, but in this case, frustrating. In Tokyo, every arrival gate camera was reviewed. The footage clearly showed the line of passengers disembarking from Flight 382. Faces were matched against the manifest. Emily's was not among them. She did not appear on any camera past the aircraft door. Investigators ran and re-ran the video in slow motion, checking for anyone whose face was obscured or for a passenger in oversized clothing that might disguise identity. Nothing matched her height, build, or manner of movement. It was as though she had never stepped off the plane. Next came the physical sweep. The aircraft had already been searched twice, but this time forensic teams approached it as a sealed crime scene. Swabs were taken from door handles, lavatory sinks, galley counters, and seatbelt buckles. The overhead bin above seat 42A was dusted for prints, revealing only Emily's and the passenger next to her. The lavatories were examined under UV light. In one, technicians found faint residue in the trash bin, traces of a sedative compound commonly used in prescription sleep aids. It wasn't strong enough to incapacitate someone entirely, but in combination with turbulence, it could have disoriented a passenger or made them easier to control. That same lavatory yielded another small but disturbing find, a torn piece of knitted fabric wedged between the hinge and frame of the folding door. Under magnification, it was consistent with the fibers from the sweater Emily had been wearing when she boarded. The piece was small, no bigger than a postage stamp, but to investigators, it suggested contact. Something physical had happened in that space. Still, even with these clues, the path forward was blocked. Without a body, there was no proof a crime had been committed. The sedative traces could have been from any passenger on a long-haul flight. The torn fabric could have been the result of catching a sleeve on the door. There was no footage showing Emily entering the lavatory at all. The evidence was circumstantial, and circumstantial evidence was not enough to accuse anyone, let alone prove an act as extraordinary as removing a passenger mid-air. Maintenance records were checked to rule out hidden spaces or structural anomalies. The aircraft, a Boeing 737, had standard service areas and no undocumented modifications. Engineering schematics showed no route from the cabin to the cargo hold that wasn't secured and monitored. Every latch, hatch, and access panel was tested. All were intact. There was no sign of tampering. The flight logs were next. Data from the cockpit voice recorder and flight data recorder revealed nothing unusual. No unplanned altitude changes, no course deviations, no unexplained shifts in cabin pressure. The turbulence had been mild, the kind that happened on almost every transoceanic flight. If anything unusual had occurred, it had happened quietly, unnoticed by the aircraft systems. For the investigators, the absence of definitive evidence was almost worse than finding something damning. It meant that whatever had happened to Emily had been carried out with precision, leaving barely a trace. That suggested either an improbable stroke of chance or the involvement of someone who understood exactly how to avoid detection in a controlled environment. Both possibilities were unsettling. In the Foster household back in California, updates from the FBI were becoming less frequent. Each call was more guarded, the tone more procedural. The family clung to the few concrete facts. Emily boarded the flight. She did not disembark. Her belongings remained on the plane. A trace of sedatives and a torn scrap of her sweater were found. Beyond that, there was nothing solid. But in the Tokyo field office, there was one lingering feeling investigators couldn't shake, the sense that they were missing something, some detail so small it had slipped past them in the noise. They couldn't yet see it, but they knew it was there. And until they found it, Emily Foster would remain, officially, a person who had entered the sky and never come back down. The possibility was raised in a closed-door meeting, almost reluctantly, by one of the senior Japanese investigators. If every inch of the plane had been searched, if there was no sign of Emily on board, and if she had not disembarked in Tokyo, then the only remaining explanation was that she was no longer on the aircraft when it landed. The theory was as horrifying as it was improbable, that Emily had somehow fallen or been forced from the plane mid-flight. It was a scenario the aviation experts resisted at first. Commercial aircraft doors are designed to be impossible to open at cruising altitude due to cabin pressure. The sheer force keeping them sealed would require equipment far beyond anything a passenger or rogue crew member could conceal. Yet, there were other, more remote possibilities: access panels, service doors at lower altitudes, coordinated maneuvers between aircraft, all theoretical, all requiring precision, all nearly impossible to execute without detection. Nearly, but not entirely. The Japanese Coast Guard and U.S. Navy were quietly brought into the discussion. Military radar data from the night of the flight was reviewed, searching for any unexplained contacts near Flight 382's path, any secondary blips that could suggest another aircraft approach during the journey. The radar records showed nothing. The only anomaly was the brief turbulence window when Emily was last confirmed moving in the cabin, but nothing outside the aircraft coincided with it. Oceanic patrol routes were examined next. The Pacific between Los Angeles and Tokyo is vast, with thousands of miles of open water. Even if a body had fallen from the plane, the impact at that altitude would have been fatal and instantaneous. The question was whether anything from such an event could have been found at all. Naval analysts ran drift pattern simulations based on wind, currents, and the exact coordinates of the suspected time frame. Search zones were drawn over thousands of square miles of ocean. In the weeks that followed, aircraft and ships quietly combed those zones without public announcement. They searched for anything, a piece of clothing, a shoe, any trace of human remains. Nothing surfaced, no debris, no personal effects, no parachute or flotation device. It was as if the ocean itself had erased her. The absence of physical evidence deepened the problem. Without a body, without wreckage, the mid-flight fall theory was nothing more than an exercise in speculation. Investigators knew it was a possibility they could not prove, and one they could not disprove. It hung over the case like a shadow, a grim explanation that brought no closure, only more questions. Back in California, the Foster family was updated privately about the search efforts. The details were sparing, the language careful. They were told the ocean had been searched extensively. They were told nothing had been found. What they were not told outright, but could sense in the pauses and formal phrasing, was that investigators were running out of places to look. Emily's mother clung to the belief that no trace meant she might still be alive somewhere. Her father stopped speaking to reporters altogether, retreating into silence. As the first anniversary of her disappearance approached, the case began to lose momentum. Funding for the active search was reduced. The Joint Task Force was scaled back. Officially, the case remained open, but its classification shifted from an active search to a long-term missing persons file. Internally, the phrasing in reports became more pointed. Foul play suspected. It was the closest any agency came to admitting they believed something criminal had happened. But without evidence, no charges could be brought and no suspects named. The airline moved on quickly. Its public statement stopped after the first year, citing the ongoing investigation. Flight 382 continued its route between Los Angeles and Tokyo without incident. For most passengers, it was just another flight. For those who had been on board that night, the thought of Emily's empty seat still lingered. The Foster family marked the one-year date quietly. There was no press conference this time, no public appeal. Friends described the house as dimly lit, the family keeping to themselves, and conversations about Emily trailing off into silence. They had been told the truth as far as the evidence allowed, but the truth was hollow, a list of what hadn't happened, not what had. For the investigators still assigned to the file, the case had reached the most dangerous stage a mystery can enter, one where the leads are gone, the public interest has faded, and the only people who still care are those who cannot move on. And in that silence, the fate of Emily Foster became just another unanswered question, adrift somewhere between two continents in a stretch of ocean that gave nothing back. The envelope arrived without warning. It was a gray padded mailer about the size of a paperback book with no return address and foreign postage marks that neither Emily's mother nor father recognized. It was resting against the front door when her mother stepped outside one early February morning in 2023. At first, she thought it might be a late-delivered package for her husband, something ordered online. But when she picked it up, she noticed the weight, light but solid, and the uneven, almost careless way the flap was sealed with strips of clear tape. Her first instinct was to check the label. There was no name, only the family's street address typed in block letters on a small white sticker. The postmark, faint but legible, read Zamboanga City, Philippines. She brought it inside, set it on the kitchen counter, and stared at it for several minutes before opening it. 10 years of unanswered questions had made her cautious. She got a pair of scissors and carefully cut the edge. Inside was a folded piece of thin cardboard, and wrapped in it was Emily's passport. It was worn, the cover edges slightly frayed, but otherwise intact. Tucked inside the passport's inner sleeve was a boarding pass for Flight 382, the same one Emily had taken the night she disappeared. The paper was yellowed, faintly creased, and matched the original record in every detail: her name, the flight number, and the departure time. Her mother felt her chest tighten. She called her husband into the kitchen, her voice trembling as she told him to look. They stood there in silence. staring at the items, each processing the same impossible thought. After all these years, how had Emily's passport come back? And why now? They called the local police, who arrived within an hour. The officers handled the passport and boarding pass with gloves, photographing each item before sealing them in evidence bags. The mailer was examined for fingerprints. Preliminary results showed partial prints, not enough to match in a database, and traces of adhesive different from the tape on the outside. The passport itself carried faint older prints consistent with Emily's known samples, but also fresher ones from someone else, a woman, based on ridge pattern analysis, though her identity remained unknown. The FBI took over quickly, recognizing the potential importance of the mailing. They tracked the postmark to a small dockside district in Zamboanga, a city in the southern Philippines known for its fishing industry and maritime traffic. The neighborhood had a history of transient laborers, foreign cargo ship crew members, seasonal workers, and others who came and went without leaving much trace. It was the kind of place where someone could disappear into the noise of daily life, where records were inconsistent and questions weren't always asked. Agents reached out to Philippine authorities, who agreed to assist in tracing the envelope's origin. Postal workers in Zamboanga remembered processing similar gray mailers, but couldn't recall the specific sender. Security cameras at the small post office were few, and their footage had already been overwritten. What they did recover was a signature from the shipping log, an illegible scrawl accompanied by a generic ID number that did not correspond to any active government-issued identification. For Emily's family, the arrival of the passport was a shock that shattered years of stasis. It reignited media interest almost immediately. News outlets ran side-by-side images of Emily's smiling face and the passport's worn cover. Commentators speculated on what it meant. Was it a cruel prank, or the first real sign she was still alive? Online forums that had been dormant for years surged back to life. Some argued the mailing was a message from Emily herself, a way of signaling she was safe. Others believed it was a warning or a taunt from whoever had taken her. Investigators approached it with guarded optimism. A decade-old missing persons case rarely got this kind of break, but without knowing who sent it, they couldn't be certain of its intent. Forensic analysis of the boarding pass revealed it had been stored somewhere humid, its fibers slightly warped, but there was no mold or water damage. The passport stamps stopped in 2013, matching the date of her disappearance, with no sign of later travel. The FBI's lab isolated a set of partial fingerprints from the inner cover of the passport that did not belong to Emily or any known family members. When run through international databases, the prints matched a Philippine national named Maribel Santos, a woman in her late 30s with a record of low-level smuggling charges tied to her time as a cruise ship employee. She had served a short prison term years earlier and was last known to be living in the Zamboanga region. When questioned, Maribel admitted to handling the passport, but claimed she had only been delivering it for a friend. She insisted she had never met Emily, but knew she was alive and safe from the people who took her. She refused to elaborate, offering no names, no locations. Authorities suspected she was protecting someone, perhaps even Emily herself, but without leverage. They could not compel more answers. Emily's parents struggled with the ambiguity. The passport's arrival was proof that someone had kept it all these years, proof it had not been destroyed, discarded, or lost to the ocean. But it was also proof of deliberate withholding, that someone, somewhere, had known where it was and had chosen to keep silent until now. As investigators pressed for more information in the Philippines, they began to suspect the mailing was not random. The choice of timing, exactly 10 years after the disappearance, and the fact it had been sent directly to the foster home suggested a message. Whether that message was a breadcrumb, an apology, or a warning, they still couldn't say. But one thing was certain. The case of Emily Foster was no longer cold. Someone had reached out from the shadows, and for the first time in a decade, there was a trail to follow. It arrived on a cold, quiet morning in February 2023, almost exactly 10 years to the day since Emily Foster had vanished. Her mother had gone to the front door expecting nothing more than the usual mail, a utility bill, a flyer, maybe a package for her husband. Instead, sitting against the welcome mat was a small, padded envelope. Gray. Light in weight, no return address. The family's home address was printed in block letters on a cheap white label, the kind you'd find at any office supply store. Above it, a foreign postmark. The ink was faded but clear enough to read Zamboanga City, Philippines. She carried it inside, her hands tightening as she felt the uneven shape beneath the padded layer. Something about the way it was sealed, strips of clear tape crisscrossed haphazardly, made her hesitate. For 10 years, nothing had come. No phone calls, no letters, no credible sightings. And now this. She laid it on the kitchen counter and stared at it for several minutes before reaching for a pair of scissors. The blade slipped cleanly through the tape. Inside was a thin piece of cardboard folded in half, acting as a stiffener. Tucked within it was Emily's passport. The deep blue cover was slightly worn at the edges, the gold lettering still visible. It was unmistakable, the same passport she had used for her trip to Japan in 2013. Slipped into the inner sleeve was a single sheet of paper, her boarding pass for Flight 382. It was yellowed with age, with faint creases running through it, but every detail was legible: her name, the flight number, and the departure gate. It matched the airline's records exactly. Her mother felt her chest tighten, her breath catch. She called for her husband, her voice unsteady. He came into the kitchen and stopped in the doorway, his eyes fixed on the passport. For a long moment, neither spoke. The items were real, tangible. 10 years after they had been last seen, they were here, in their home, with no explanation. The police arrived within the hour. They wore gloves as they photographed the passport and boarding pass before sealing them into evidence bags. The envelope was dusted for prints, the faint patterns captured with black powder and tape. Forensic technicians worked quickly. Preliminary results were baffling. The passport bore faint fingerprints consistent with Emily's known prints, likely from before her disappearance. But the envelope itself carried fresh, distinct prints from someone else, a woman, according to the ridge pattern analysis. The FBI took control of the evidence the same day. The postmark was traced to a small dockside district in Zamboanga, a busy port city in the southern Philippines. The neighborhood was a mix of fishing piers, open-air markets, and small shipping offices. It was also a transit hub for cargo vessels moving between Southeast Asia's islands, a place where people came and went anonymously, where records could be bent or erased entirely. Investigators worked through the Philippine Postal Service, but the paper trail was thin. The mailing log at the Zamboanga post office showed the package had been handed over in person, postage paid in cash. The sender's name was left blank. Security cameras at the counter had already overwritten their recordings by the time the inquiry was made. The only clue was the handling of the passport itself, the fresh fingerprints from an unidentified woman. Weeks later, those prints came back from the international database with a match. The name was unfamiliar to U.S. authorities: Maribel Santos, a 38-year-old Philippine national with a history of low-level smuggling charges tied to her work as a cruise ship employee. She had served a brief prison term years earlier for transporting undocumented passengers between islands and was last known to be living in the Zamboanga region. Through Philippine police, agents arranged an interview. Maribel admitted she had handled the passport but denied any involvement in Emily's disappearance. She claimed she had been given the envelope by a friend and told to send it to the United States. When asked who the friend was, she refused to say. She did, however, make one statement that unsettled the investigators. She claimed Emily was alive. When pressed for proof, she would only say, "She's safe from the people who took her." She offered no names, no locations, and no further details. Back in California, the Foster family struggled to process what the envelope meant. After years of silence, this was proof that someone, somewhere, had kept Emily's passport and boarding pass intact for a decade. Proof they hadn't been lost to the ocean or destroyed in some hidden crime. But it was also proof of deliberate withholding. Whoever sent the envelope had chosen this moment 10 years later to make contact. And they had done it in a way that raised as many questions as it answered. In the weeks that followed, the FBI debated the meaning of the timing. Was it a signal from Emily herself, a quiet message to her family, a taunt from whoever had taken her? Or was it something else entirely, a breadcrumb meant to draw just enough attention to change the course of the investigation. Whatever the answer, the effect was immediate. The case of Emily Foster, dormant for a decade, was suddenly open again. And somewhere beyond the Pacific, a woman's fingerprints and the choice to mail an old passport had just become the most important lead they had ever found. Maribel's bus ticket led investigators into the rural interior of Mindanao, hours away from the crowded docks of Zamboanga. The road narrowed into winding stretches lined with coconut groves and small villages where the presence of outsiders was instantly noticed. Local police, working with Interpol, shadowed her discreetly, keeping distance so as not to alarm whoever she might be meeting. Her movements were cautious, her head turning often, scanning the roadside as though she knew she was being watched. The trail ended at a cluster of small houses built from cinder block and corrugated metal, surrounded by overgrown brush. It was a place that looked self-contained, the kind of community where everyone knew each other and outsiders rarely came. Maribel walked through the gate of one property, spoke briefly with someone out of sight, and disappeared inside. The surveillance team kept their position, cameras trained on the front of the house waiting for a face to appear. Hours passed before the door opened again. Maribel emerged, speaking to a thin woman in a long-sleeved shirt and cap pulled low. Her posture was tense, her body angled away from the street. Even from a distance, something about her movement caught the attention of the lead investigator, the way she kept her head down and the careful, deliberate pace. A camera lens zoomed in. When the woman briefly looked up, the frame froze. The face was older, the features sharper, but the eyes were unmistakable. 10 years had passed, yet it was her, Emily Foster. The confirmation set off a chain of rapid but careful decisions. Any direct approach risked spooking her or whoever controlled her movements. The team needed to know if she was free to leave or under restraint, whether she would come willingly or whether an extraction would be necessary. Local authorities arranged for plainclothes officers to take up positions nearby. Over the next day, they observed Emily moving between the house and a small outbuilding, sometimes speaking with Maribel, sometimes sitting alone on a shaded porch. She never left the property. When the decision was finally made to approach, it was done quietly. 2 female officers knocked on the door under the pretext of routine local inquiries. Maribel answered, her expression hardening instantly when she saw them. Behind her, Emily stood frozen, her eyes flicking between the officers in the open doorway as though weighing a choice. The lead officer addressed her by name. There was a pause, a single heartbeat of silence, before Emily stepped forward. In the safe house hours later, her first words to investigators were measured, almost flat, as if she had rehearsed them for years. She confirmed her identity and said she was ready to go home. But when they pressed for details, her account began to unfold into something far more complex than anyone had expected. She described being on Flight 382 the night she vanished, walking toward the rear galley during turbulence. A man she didn't recognize spoke to her, telling her there was a problem with her seat and that she needed to follow him. She remembered stepping into a narrow service area, the air cooler there, the sound of the engines louder. Something sharp pricked her arm. Her memory after that was fragmented. She recalled waking in darkness, the floor vibrating beneath her, the sound of machinery all around. She was told she was on another aircraft, smaller, noisier, and that she was being relocated. She was warned not to resist, that people had paid for her removal. The days and nights blurred as she was moved between locations, fishing vessels, dockside warehouses, isolated houses on remote islands. She never knew where she was for long. Communication with the outside world was impossible. Emily said she was not physically harmed in the way investigators had feared, but she was never free. She was told she was protected from something, though no one would say from what. The people guarding her were transient, some friendly, others cold, but always watchful. She suspected she was being hidden from whoever had orchestrated her abduction, though she never understood why she had been taken in the first place. Maribel had been one of the few constants over the years, appearing sporadically with supplies or instructions. Emily said she trusted her more than the others, though she knew Maribel was part of the network keeping her in place. It was Maribel who eventually told her she could leave, arranging for the passport to be mailed as a signal to her family and to test whether it was safe for her to surface. Emily had hesitated for weeks, afraid the people who had taken her would find her again. When investigators asked why she had agreed to meet them now, she said she was tired of running without knowing what she was running from. She wanted to see her family. She wanted her life back. But she also warned that the people behind her disappearance were still out there, still capable of reaching across borders. Her return was arranged under extreme secrecy. The Foster family was flown to a secure location where they were reunited with her for the first time in a decade. The meeting was emotional but subdued, shadowed by the knowledge that Emily's story was still incomplete. She could answer the question of where she had been, but not who had taken her or why. In the weeks that followed, her testimony was recorded in detail, cross-referenced against flight records, maritime logs, and known trafficking routes. The evidence supported her movements after leaving the aircraft, but the critical gap, how she was removed mid-flight without triggering alarms, remained unsolved. The working theory was a covert transfer involving another aircraft, executed during the turbulence window, but proving it was beyond the reach of the current investigation. For Emily, the priority was safety. She entered a protection program, her location kept confidential. For the investigators, the case was technically still open, but they all knew the odds of bringing her abductors to justice were slim. The network had dissolved into shadows, leaving only fragments behind. And yet, the decade-long silence had been broken. Emily Foster had not been lost to the ocean or vanished into thin air. She had been hidden, deliberately, by people who knew exactly how to make someone disappear, and for reasons still unknown, they had finally let her go. For weeks, investigators kept their distance, watching the woman whose fingerprints had been found on Emily Foster's passport. Her movements were erratic, days of staying within the port area followed by sudden, unannounced trips inland. It was during one of these excursions that she boarded a bus heading deep into Mindanao's interior, far from the noise of the docks. The route wound through miles of rural farmland before stopping near a cluster of small walled properties surrounded by heavy vegetation. From the road, they looked unremarkable, but through a long lens camera, one particular compound stood out. The same woman was seen walking through its gate, greeted by someone out of view. The surveillance team held position, knowing any premature move could end the operation. 2 days passed before they caught sight of her again. This time, she wasn't alone. Walking beside her was a thin woman in plain clothes, her cap pulled low, her posture guarded. The way she moved was cautious, her eyes scanning every direction, as though she was accustomed to living in a place where every step had to be measured. When she briefly turned toward the sun, the cameras caught her face. It was older, the angles sharper, but the eyes were unmistakable. 10 years after she had disappeared without a trace, there was no doubt. This was Emily Foster. The decision to approach was made with care. Officers needed to confirm she was not being coerced before making contact. When they finally knocked on the compound's gate, it was under the guise of a local welfare check. The woman with the fingerprints, Maribel Santos, answered first. Standing just behind her, Emily froze when she heard her name spoken by one of the officers. For a moment she didn't move, then she stepped forward. Her voice was quiet but steady when she confirmed who she was. Hours later, in a safe location away from the compound, Emily began to tell her story. She described that night on Flight 382, how she had gotten up during turbulence and been stopped by a man she didn't recognize. He told her there was an issue with her seat and she needed to follow him to the rear service area. The last thing she remembered clearly was stepping into the narrow space, the air cooler there, the sound of the engines louder, and then a sharp sting in her arm. When she regained partial awareness, she was lying in a cramped compartment, her body heavy, her thoughts scattered. She realized she was no longer on the passenger aircraft. The engines sounded different, rougher. She learnt later she had been transferred mid-air during a covert maneuver involving a cargo plane flying in close formation with the passenger jet, a method she said was part of a sophisticated trafficking network. The turbulence had masked the shift in altitude needed for the transfer, and the compartment she was smuggled into was one used for maintenance equipment modified for human transport. From that night forward, her life was a series of relocations. She spent months at a time aboard remote fishing vessels, then in isolated safe houses on small islands where strangers controlled her movements. She was never allowed to contact her family. Her captors spoke of her as valuable, but gave no clear reason why she had been taken. She was told that as long as she cooperated, she would be safe, from whom she never knew. Maribel entered her life sporadically, arriving with supplies or relaying instructions. She was different from the others, less guarded, willing to talk. Over time, Emily began to trust her. Maribel became the only person she confided in, the one link to any possibility of escape. That chance finally came when Maribel hinted she was no longer working for the same people who had orchestrated the abduction. She told Emily she could help her disappear from the network entirely, but they would have to do it carefully. Mailing the passport to her family was the first step, a way to see if it was safe to move without drawing attention from the wrong people. Emily lived in constant fear during that waiting period. She knew the network's reach was vast. She had seen other captives vanish after attempting escape. But when Maribel returned weeks later and said the time was right, Emily agreed. The inland compound had been a temporary hideout, chosen because it was far from the shipping lanes and the prying eyes of the port. In recounting her ordeal, Emily spoke with a calm that didn't match the weight of her words. The trauma was there, beneath the surface, but her focus was on the facts, on giving investigators the information they needed to dismantle what had held her for so long. She said she didn't know the names of the people at the top, only that they operated across borders and used the sea as their shield. For investigators, her account filled in some of the missing pieces but left others unanswered. They now understood how she could vanish from a sealed aircraft without triggering alarms. But the identities of those who ordered it and the reason she had been targeted were still out of reach. The network was practiced in erasing its footprints, and even with Emily's testimony, pursuing it would be a fight without guarantees. For now, what mattered was that Emily Foster was alive, standing in a safe room halfway across the world from the place she had been held. And for the first time in a decade, the question was no longer whether she would be found, but what would happen when the world learnt she had returned. Emily Foster's return was never going to be simple. After 10 years missing, the moment she set foot back on American soil was supposed to be quiet, controlled, and away from the noise. Federal agents had arranged for her arrival through a side terminal, but the secrecy didn't hold. Somewhere along the chain, word leaked, and by the time her flight landed, a handful of reporters were already gathered outside the secure gate. Within hours, the story was everywhere. The college student who had vanished mid-air in 2013 was alive. Her reunion with her family happened behind closed doors in a government building. It was not a dramatic embrace, not the tears and chaos that the public might picture. It was slower, quieter, and weighted with the kind of disbelief that takes time to wear off. Her mother's hands lingered on her face, studying her features as if making sure they were real. Her father didn't speak, just pulled her close and didn't let go. 10 years of waiting had not prepared them for the reality of having her back, or for the truth of what she'd endured. In interviews with investigators, Emily described a network that was disciplined, well-resourced, and invisible to most law enforcement. The way she was taken, a mid-air extraction masked by turbulence and executed with precision, was unlike anything aviation experts had encountered. It involved a secondary cargo aircraft, specialized compartments, and a window of minutes. She remembered the sting of an injection, waking in darkness and being told she was in transit. The years that followed were spent between remote fishing vessels and hidden safe houses in places where outsiders rarely came. Communication with her family was never allowed. The people around her changed often, but the rules stayed the same. The problem for prosecutors was that much of her account, while credible, was nearly impossible to prove. There were no surviving records of the cargo plane, no physical evidence of the transfer. Every location she described had been abandoned or cleared before authorities could reach it. The few people she could name had either disappeared or were beyond the reach of U.S. jurisdiction. The one person in custody was Maribel Santos, the woman who had mailed Emily's passport to her family. She faced charges for her role in aiding the network, but prosecutors quickly realized her cooperation might be their only way forward. After negotiations, she was granted partial immunity in exchange for detailed testimony about the routes, the vessels, and the operational methods she had seen over the years. The decision drew criticism, but law enforcement argued it was the only way to map the structure of a network that had proved untouchable for a decade. Maribel's account, combined with Emily's, revealed just enough to prompt targeted raids in multiple countries. They learnt of modified fishing vessels with hidden compartments, falsified crew rosters used to move people across maritime borders, and a chain of isolated island communities serving as transit points. Some arrests were made, and certain smuggling operations were disrupted, but the upper tier of the organization remained out of reach. The leadership had no fixed location, no paper trail, and was insulated by layers of intermediaries. Where the investigation stalled, policy reform advanced quickly. Emily's case became a catalyst for changes in international aviation security. Airlines were required to implement real-time passenger tracking during flights, logging any movement into crew-only areas. Service compartments were redesigned to eliminate unmonitored spaces, and turbulence protocols were revised to ensure no passenger could be relocated without immediate verification by multiple crew members. Her survival had forced the industry to confront a scenario it had never formally prepared for, and to close the loopholes that had allowed it to happen. The public reception was intense. For weeks, Emily's name trended online, her image appearing on every major news site. People dissected her limited statements and debated whether her captor's motives were political, criminal, or personal. She gave only one controlled interview, focusing not on the details of her captivity, but on the changes needed to prevent similar crimes. After that, she withdrew from public life, choosing privacy over prolonged media attention. For her family, the passport that had arrived months earlier was more than a clue. It was the turning point. It had been in someone's possession for a decade, preserved deliberately, and sent at a moment that triggered everything that followed. They kept it, along with the yellowed boarding pass, in a display case at home. For them, it was a reminder of the silence they had lived in and of the moment that silence broke. Justice, in the fullest sense, never came. Some of the people Emily had named were captured. Others vanished before they could be found. The network adapted to the disruption, shifting operations and continuing out of reach. Investigators admitted privately that the full truth of why Emily had been taken and by whom might never be uncovered. The most they could do was close the gaps in systems that had allowed it to happen. In private, away from the headlines, the Foster family's life began to take a new shape. Dinners were quieter, holidays were different, the years could not be given back, and some questions could not be answered. But Emily was there, alive, present, a living contradiction to the certainty so many had once had that she was gone forever. That, her parents told themselves, was enough. Even so, there was always an unspoken awareness that the people who had once moved her across oceans without leaving a trace had not all been caught. That somewhere, someone might still think of her as unfinished business. It was a shadow they lived with, one that would likely never go away. Still, the fact remained. The passport had been the key. Without it, there would have been no search in the Philippines, no discovery in the inland compound, and no chance for Emily to walk back into her parents' lives. In the end, that single envelope had undone 10 years of silence and changed the trajectory of a case everyone had assumed would remain unsolved.